Thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it. Thank you for attending the 10th anniversary of B-Sides Pittsburgh. That's pretty cool. So there's an awful lot of talk about stopping ransomware, and threat hunting is part of it. And what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about some of the threat hunting things that people kind of miss when it comes to ransomware. This actually started as a thread on Twitter, so actually Twitter can be useful sometimes, who knew? But it turned out to be really good with a lot of really good advice and inputs from a lot of people that do DFIR for a living, so really appreciate it. If you're wondering about the title, I am the ransomware sommelier, which means that I do help you pair the right ransomware with the flaws in your network. So, if you don't have MFA enabled, I'll give you a nice lock bit. Whereas if you have MFA enabled, but maybe you're not monitoring your endpoint solutions, I'll get you a copy of Alpha V or Black Hat. So, before we get into this, let's talk about the state of ransomware. So far this year, we've seen it's actually more like 1,700 victims posted to ransomware extortion sites. And ransomware extortion sites, for reference, are becoming a less effective measure of the number of ransomware attacks in the world than it was in like 2020 and early 2021. A lot of ransomware groups, while some are relying even more heavily on their extortion sites, others are using their extortion sites less. We've also seen 28 law enforcement actions taken against ransomware groups in the last year, which is more than we saw in the previous 5 years combined. And when we're talking about even Russia getting involved with arresting some members of REvil, and then of course a few months later letting them go so that they can go work for the Russian government. So that's great. But we aren't just seeing indictments and sanctions. We're actually seeing ransomware actors being extradited to the U.S. and standing trial, which is again great. We love to see that. But of course, as you all know, right now it's not slowing down ransomware attacks. If anything, other than a break in June, because even ransomware actors have to go on vacation, we've pretty much seen an acceleration in ransomware attacks this year. So we're still talking about lots of whack-a-mole. But the reason that I'm excited about all the law enforcement activity that we're seeing worldwide is that, whack-a-mole is a sport like any other. So if you go out to Coney Island, or Kennywood, I guess, since we're in Pittsburgh, if you go out to Kennywood twice a year and play whack-a-mole, you're going to get okay at it, but you're never going to be really good at it. If you want to be a professional whack-a-mole player, you got to go out to Kennywood every week and practice your whack-a-mole skills. And that's where I think we're doing. We're early on in that process, and so the sanctions, the intergovernmental cooperation and all that are having an impact. It's not as fast as we'd like, but law enforcement never moves as fast as we'd like. So I think it's good that we're seeing that, and I know we're all cynical in InfoSec, but I do think it's good, and I think eventually we'll see good returns from this activity. One of the other things that's kind of concerning this year is in the last 6 months, we've seen 60 new ransomware variants launched. So 60 new groups, none of them using new code. A lot of them are using stolen chaos code, stolen Conti code, stolen REvil code. But what we're seeing is a lot of these new groups don't want to be part of a larger RAS organization. They saw what happened with Conti and the collapse of Conti earlier this year. Now Karakut mostly. And so what they're doing is stealing the code and starting their own ransomware service. Generally not offering RAS. They're generally just, hey, it's us 5 guys, and we're still going to buy from initial access brokers and so on. And we're going to go out and we're going to run our own ransomware operations. So that may make things harder to track going forward. I mean, every day on Twitter I now see, or in some of my like private Slack channels and other places, I see people saying, hey, have you heard of this variant? Or have you heard of this variant? Or have you heard of this variant? Because we're just seeing so many new ones pop up that it's really difficult to keep track of. So we're also seeing ransomware go global. We're seeing ransomware out of Iran, out of China, UK and Brazil with Lapsus, and you can argue with me about whether or not Lapsus is ransomware, but essentially extortion type groups. Mandiant has a really fancy word for it because Mandiant has to have fancy words for everything. I forget the phrase they use, but it's like extortion groups or whatever. And then we just saw the report about Maui operating out of North Korea, but of course North Korea has been using other types of ransomware for years. So again, extortion is super important to these ransomware groups now. More and more companies are doing better with their backups. Shockingly, it only took us 10 years of yelling about that to actually get them to implement backups. So it's great that we're actually seeing those backups be implemented and implemented correctly. So not backups, oh, we saved everything on the file server that got encrypted. We're actually seeing more offline backups. We're seeing more backups that are immutable. We're seeing companies going back to tape, which is awesome. Tape actually works really well. Ransomware actors haven't figured out how to encrypt tape yet. I like that. So that extortion becomes more important. And again, as I said, we're seeing groups like Lapsus that are extortion only. They don't actually encrypt anything. They only steal files and then demand encryption. Am I moving too much for you? I know you're trying to stream this. I just want to make sure I'm not like... I'm good? Okay. So if you can extort ransom demand from traditional means, that blackmail becomes more important. And so we're seeing this explosion in the extortion ecosystem, not just the sensitive files anymore, but we've seen things like false media amplification. So we saw this in the NRA ransomware attack last year, where Grief paid for false amplification of mentions of the NRA attack to try and drive attention to it, and then force the NRA to pay. We're seeing some personal attacks. I know some researchers have been personally threatened by ransomware groups. Fortunately for me, I'm not important enough to be threatened, and I like that. We're also seeing ransomware actors reach out to clients. So especially in schools, this has become a big problem. They'll encrypt data for schools, they'll steal the data for schools, and then they'll email the parents and say, hey, we're going to publish your kid's sensitive data to our extortion site unless you tell the school to pay. So we're seeing a lot of these kind of activities, DDoS attacks and so on, are really growing in popularity. And so that's what gets to the heart of this. The extortion means that threat actors have to spend more time in the network, and because they have to spend more time in the network, that means more hands-on keyboard activity, and more hands-on keyboard activity means there's actually more opportunity for you as a defender to catch them. And I won't sugarcoat this. Good threat hunting is hard. It takes planning. It takes knowing and understanding your network. So it's easy for me to come up here and say, oh, yeah, you got to do threat hunting, blah, 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 get to it. I know it's a lot harder than that, but it is worth it if you can put together a threat hunting program. We do need to talk about dwell time, though. So dwell time, for those of you who don't know, is the time that the attackers spend inside the network. You will see over and over again this quote of 43 days for dwell time. Please don't take that as gospel. It is a lot sooner than that. It's not quite as soon as I know I've seen like DPipes report has published, from initial intrusion to ransomware in 5 hours. It's not quite that bad, but generally, at least in the cases I've been involved in, it's maybe a few days to a week is what we're seeing. That's still plenty of time. And your mileage may vary. That's one of the other challenges with ransomware is everybody has a different view into ransomware attacks. And so what I see may not be what you see, may not be what Mandiant sees, may not be what Palo Alto sees, et cetera. But from what I'm seeing, you generally have a few days to a week from initial access to when the ransomware is deployed. And part of that is that distinction in terms of activity from the initial access broker to the actual ransomware actor. So generally, there's two parts to an attack. The initial access broker gets the access, and they'll generally do that. We see this through phishing campaigns, credential reuse, credential stuffing attacks, which are really, really big right now, straight up exploitation for commonly exposed items, and then, of course, coming in through third parties. Those are really the big things that we see in terms of in terms of how that initial access happens. So that initial access is that first part of that attack. And depending on how the initial access broker works, you then have a few days to maybe a week or two before the ransomware actor takes over. So some initial access brokers work directly for ransomware groups. Conti famously pioneered this activity where they basically contracted their initial access brokers so that the initial access brokers only worked for them. But a lot of other, especially smaller ransomware groups, don't have their own initial access brokers, so they have to buy on underground forums, et cetera. We are seeing the number of ads for networks for sale on open forums slow down, and that's because most of this activity are moving to private Telegram and Tox channels, just because all of the initial access brokers know that jackasses like me are watching for all of these and trying to alert people to let them know that, hey, your stuff's for sale, you should probably fix this. So we are seeing more of this move to private Telegram channels and talks, but there's still an awful lot of initial access broker activity, which is really interesting. Complete side note and digression here, but just in case you're not scared enough after coming to this event, I was talking to Crane Hassold, who's head of intelligence at Abnormal Security at RSA, and he's saying that he was telling me that they're starting to see business email compromise actors out of Africa reaching out to those same initial access brokers to try and buy that access, because then they can send their business email compromise emails directly from the email server, which is going to be so much more difficult to detect and find. So something to look out for going forward, that there may not just be ransomware groups using the initial access brokers. We may start seeing business email compromise groups also using initial access brokers, again, in case you didn't want to sleep ever again. So let's talk about threat hunting. Unless anybody has any questions about everything I've covered so far or thinks I'm full of shit with anything I've said. No? Okay. So this is basically what a modern ransomware attack looks like. As I already talked about, initial access, generally phishing, credential stuffing, credential reuse, third party. Third party is really big right now. We see so many ransomware groups or initial access brokers that will get that initial access, and they'll get that initial access, and they'll realize, oh, hey, this company would be better to get access to their customers than it would be to actually ransom them. So they use them to jump to a whole bunch of other clients. Exploitation, Recorded Future tracked 52 different vulnerabilities used for initial access by ransomware groups last year, almost none of which were zero-day. They're common, pretty much well-known vulnerabilities with proof of concept code. So they're not necessarily using 0 days, although you'll hear about that because every time they do use one, it makes the news. Most of them are just the everyday stuff, just people don't patch things that are exposed to the internet, so please do that. Insider threat is really interesting because both Lockbit, Lapsus, and Lapsus are very interested in insider threat. Lockbit in their note includes, hey, if you're interested in having us help us hack your company, send us an email and we'll give you some money to do that. The good news is right now they suck at it. We haven't seen any successful confirmed case of insider threat. We've seen some rumors that there may have been some, but nothing that's been publicly reported. And the one publicly reported case was Tesla last year, where the Russian that tried to do it got detained at the airport and the FBI got involved. But the fact that they're very interested in it means that this will probably be more of a threat going forward. Ransomware actors tend to suck at things when they first start doing them, and then they get a lot better at them because they do it a lot. So from there, you'll see Cobalt Strike. We see some more Sliver now, or PS Exec as they move through the network. That's all the tools they use. Ransomware actors don't like the command line. Some of them do. For the most part, they don't. So we see a whole lot of remote control through RDP, TeamViewer, AnyDesk, all of those down at the bottom. And then they'll get access to all the servers they need. They'll steal all the files. They love mega.io. Mega.io and any of its subdomains, that's where they love to send all of their data, because then they don't have to build additional command and control infrastructure. They can just send it all up to there, and they can pay for their mega.io accounts with Bitcoin. Then they'll run a couple of tests. So test a couple of boxes, make sure that the encryption works. And then they'll encrypt your whole network as much as they can, try and delete logs and clean up. And then you'll have the extortion site, which can happen days later or months later, depending on the ransomware group, or it might never happen. And just because a victim never appears on an extortion site does not necessarily mean they paid. Most of these guys, English isn't their first or second or third language, and so they have a list of keywords they look for. And I've seen a number of times where they just pulled out crap data, so they don't even bother to throw it up on the extortion site. We had one client that I was helping that they pulled up a bunch of old log data from systems that hadn't been used since 2005, and I asked them why they even kept the logs. But it turned out it was a great honeypot, because the ransomware actor stole all that data and they didn't care. So they had a good laugh. It's not very often you get to have a good laugh when you're in the negotiation chat with the ransomware actors, but they did have a good laugh about that. So when we talk about threat hunting, what are we talking about? We're talking about taking intelligence that you get from someplace. So whether it's a talk like this, if you follow Florian Roth on Twitter, and if you're on Twitter, you should definitely follow Florian Roth, because his Sigma roles are amazing. But if you follow the DFIR report website, they have incredible intelligence that they deliver from their attacks. There are all kinds of great places where you can get your threat intelligence. You can also buy a subscription to Recorded Future, where you happen to have a booth right outside the door, but I'm not here to plug Recorded Future. You get your intelligence from wherever you get it from. You want to build your threat hunting packages that look for the expected badness, and figure that the intelligence that you're getting is not necessarily going to work exactly for your network. So you're probably going to have to refine your searches, because you're going to get some false positives. You're going to get some, there are going to be some mistakes. There are going to be some, differences in the way every network's a little bit different. So there will be some vagaries in, I got this intelligence, but my network doesn't quite respond to this, and so we're going to make changes, and then always provide feedback. That feedback loop is so important to wherever you're getting your data from. Hey, you did this. I just want you to know that in our network, because we have this didn't work, and that allows it to improve, so that the next person that gets that pulls that intelligence down will have a more refined and better solution. This is especially true with Yara and Sigma roles. So again, good threat hunting only works when you have good network hygiene in place. If you don't know what assets you have, it's really hard to hunt for them. And asset management's one of those things. I'm old. I've been doing this for a really long time, and I've been talking about the need for good asset management basically since I've been in InfoSec. And we're still talking about it, so it still isn't a solved problem, unfortunately, despite all the companies that will tell you that they've solved the problem. And so, but you need to have good asset management, because if you're only threat hunting part of the network, you're missing a lot of stuff. And it's always hard to tell people this, because asset management and good vulnerability management isn't sexy. Nobody's going to invite you to give a talk at RSA or Black Hat because you've managed to do good asset management, even though I feel like they should, because that is actually pretty impressive. But whereas like when I get to come up and talk about threat hunting, everybody's like, oh, threat hunting is sexy. I mean, as sexy as something in InfoSec can be, especially when delivered by an old white guy like me. But without the basics, the cool fun stuff doesn't work, and it's just going to actually make you less secure. And so what you want to understand is how ransomware attacks work, the kind of tools that ransomware actors are using, and especially as those tools change, and then what detections work. So this is an example, and I like to think of this, kind of like a threat hunting is kind of like a boxing match, right? You don't necessarily have to get a knockout in the first round. It's, if you go to the second or third round, all those different stages that we talked about before, if you go to the second or third round, as long as you get the TKO in the end, that's what matters. So wherever you happen to detect them, depending on your capability and depending on what you have in your network. And that's the other thing I like to tell people. One of the things I think we've done as an industry that's kind of a disservice is every time we are trying to solve a problem, we solve the problem by selling you a box or an agent, right? And this has been going on for 30 years, right? Oh, hey, people are getting into your network. Here's the firewall. Firewalls don't detect everything. Well, great. Here's an IDS. Well, IDSs don't detect everything. Well, here's some endpoints protection. Well, that's not detecting everything. Well, here's a web application firewall. Here's a proxy. And then you wind up with 30 different things in your security tech stack, none of which talk to each other. So here, now you have a SIM that you can send all the logs to. Oh, but they don't correlate very well. Things get missed. So when you're doing your threat hunting, I always recommend people take the tools that you have already and start repurposing those for threat hunting. Don't go buy new tools. If you can't do everything we're talking about here today, so like if you don't have EDR, so you don't have a way to shove YARA rules or Sigma rules, look at some of the other things that we're going to talk about. You want to start with the basics, get really good with those, and then move forward to the other things. So that being said, this is a great YARA rule from DFIR report on detecting Quackbot. A lot of ransomware actors have moved, especially with TrickBot being all weird, have moved to IceID and moved to Quackbot for that initial delivery mechanism through their phishing emails. So being able to detect that initial entry is really important. You can stop the attack before they get started. Same thing with SOC Ghoulish. So SOC Ghoulish also delivered as part of phishing attacks. Generally, you're downloading a JavaScript compressed file, but this is another YARA rule for detecting SOC Ghoulish. This looks for the specific JavaScript hashes that were used, so this looks for the specific Java hashes that were associated with this, and this was Wasted Locker delivering JavaScript through SOC Ghoulish early on. There are other really good YARA rules, Sigma rules for detecting SOC Ghoulish as well. PowerShell. We're going to be a little interactive here for a second, so hopefully y'all don't mind raising your hands. Too many organizations I walk into don't have PowerShell logging turned on. Please do that. Doesn't cost you anything. I mean, I know it costs you because Splunk charges an arm and a leg for every extra line of log that you collect. But remember when Splunk was like the cool vendor that gave out T-shirts at conferences, and now they're like, oh wow, I can't afford my Splunk bill anymore. Please, no offense to anybody from Splunk that works here. You still make a great product. You're just super expensive. But ransomware groups that rely heavily on PowerShell scripts. So If you can turn on PowerShell logging and collect those PowerShell logging, it's a great threat hunting tool. Some of the simple things, if any of you ever take Chris Sanders' PowerShell hunting course, which I highly recommend, or a threat hunting course, which I highly recommend, he does a great section on PowerShell. But one of the simple things to do is, and again, this involves knowing your network. This involves knowing your network. Know what PowerShell scripts are supposed to be running in your network. Start with that. Okay, these are the knowns. This is what's supposed to be there. And then look for PowerShell scripts that aren't supposed to be running in your network, that are only running on 1 or 2 machines. So that's a simple threat hunting thing that is only required, your only required knowledge is what is supposed to happen in your network. Look for anything that's either disabling or creating new admin accounts. Ransomware actors love to make new admin accounts. Look for new scripts. Look for scripts running at odd times. Ransomware actors love to work Friday evening and Saturday evening because they know the SOCs are less staffed. And then what else? So for those of you that are doing PowerShell logging and threat hunting, what else do you look for as part of this? Yes, sir. I'm sorry? Yep. That's very good. Anything else? Yes. Network connections. That's another really good one. Yes. So anybody else? Okay. At least we got 2. I'm happy that we've got some level of participation here. It means I'm not putting you all to sleep right after lunch. But really think about the ways that you can use PowerShell logging and what you know about your network to find other things. I will say one other thing that a lot of people don't catch, and this even isn't with PowerShell. The first thing that a lot of ransomware actors do when they get in is they shut down your security tool. So they shut down your antivirus, they shut down your EDR or whatever. Most organizations don't set that as a high alert. So if another process is shutting down your security process, so not part of closing the normal part of shutting down the computer, but another process shutting it off, that should be a high alert because generally the only people who are doing that are bad guys and employees that are trying to do bad things. So, I know some analysts will tell me, no, I have to do it because I have to, because I have to do malware analysis or whatever. You should have a separate machine for doing that. You shouldn't be doing it on your work machine connected to the work network. So be looking for AV systems shutting down or security shells shutting down. Again, we mentioned the GUIs earlier. If you're not using these GUIs in your network, if you're not using Screen Connect, AnyDesk, SplashTop, or other remote GUI topics, get those file hashes, look for those. So you can feed those into your EDR, and you can be looking for that, because all the ransomware actors do is they download the executable from wherever they keep their tools, and then they execute it back to wherever they are in Russia and keep working. So look for those tools, and that should be a high alert. Because again, if you have an employee that's using one of these GUIs, they're probably not doing anything you want them to do anyway. They may not be doing something bad, but they may not be doing something that you want. Cobalt Strike. We see so much Cobalt Strike from the ransomware groups. We're starting to see a little more Sliver than we used to. So Sliver is another one, and I'm going to put together a couple slides on that. There was just a report that some ransomware groups are using Brute Ratel as well. The creator of Brute Ratel denies that. But it still can't hurt, because at the worst that happens is if you find any Brute Ratel in your network, the worst that happens is you catch your red team doing red team things, and congratulations. So look for any of these tools that are being used by these ransomware groups, these red teaming tools that the ransomware groups like to use. So this is an example of looking for Cobalt Strike loader. But then this is a great one from Kyle Cucci. I love this because this you don't have to have any kind of Yara or Sigma capability. This looks for the name DPipes. So by default, and interestingly, most ransomware groups keep the default settings in their Cobalt Strike because They don't necessarily know how to use it well. They just know how to use it, and the tool itself works really well. But looking for these default pipes that are formatted as MSSE-4 digits-server, look for event ID pipe created and 18 pipe connected for these alerts. You do have to turn on sysmon in order to catch this level of logging. And again, I know making you have more logs and collect more logs is easy for me to say, but hard on your budget. It is worth it, and the type of data that you can collect with sysmon and using the sysinternals tools can be very beneficial. AdFind is another one that ransomware actors really like. We see a lot of AdFind and Bloodhound. So again, going back to the other slide where we walked through, any of those tools, basically, you want to look for them, and you want to look for them in all of the different various forms, whether it's, some of these you can inject into memory, some of these you just operate as an executable on the ground, etc. Some of them have been converted to scripts, to script formats. So whatever those forms are, you want to look for those. But AdFind is one that goes unnoticed by a lot, but I do see it in a lot of ransomware attacks. Then data transfer. If you are not using mega.io for anything legitimate, just block it and all of its domains. The ransomware actors love mega.io, again, because they can pay in Bitcoin, it's cheap, and they can upload unlimited amounts of data from your network. And so any of the mega.io, mega.nz, and there's like 10 other domains that are associated with them. Find all those domains and just block them. That's an easy thing. Understand ransomware actors will figure out a way around that. They can set up their own command and control server and exfil the data that way. But at least you've made it a little more difficult for them. And most of the organizations that I talk to and that I've worked with don't actually use mega.io for internal file transfers, even though they do have business accounts. Most of them are using, using other services. But along with that, look for the tools that the ransomware actors like to use to compress and exfil the data, rclone, 7-zip, megasync, and other file transfer tools like that. There's quite a list of them that the ransomware actors use. So look for those, and again, look for those on your network, get the file hashes, because they're using the legitimate versions of these tools. So the file hashes are publicly available, and they don't change very often, which is nice. And again, that only works if you know the tools aren't being used by your internal admin staff. Obviously, you don't want to, falsely flag anything in your that your IT staff or your security staff may be using. Shadow copy deletion. I almost hate to include this because this is kind of like, your last ditch effort. But I'll throw it out there just because you have it. Every ransomware group that I know of deletes shadow copies right before they start the encryption process. So deleting shadow copies is absolutely a sign that you are about to be hit with ransomware. The problem is that it's a sign you're being hit with ransomware now. So for most organizations, if you have an alert like this set up, it's going to travel through the logs. It's going to go through it's going to go to your SIM. It's going to bubble through the SIM process. 15 minutes later, if you're lucky, 15 minutes later, you're going to get an alert that says, hey, shadow copies have been deleted on the server. By then, it's too late. They're already halfway through encrypting the machine and probably other machines as well. So I hate to include this as a threat hunting detection, but if you can maybe stop, to limit the damage, especially if you have good network segmentation, which most networks I walk into don't, unfortunately. But if you have good network segmentation, this does help limit the damage. There are some tools out there. Again, Florian Roth makes one that will automatically delete any process that tries to delete shadow copies. And there are ways to configure your EDR, if you're using EDR, that, hey, if something deletes shadow copies, kill that process and send the alert, and then isolate the machine from the rest of the network. So you can automate that, and if you have those automation capabilities, I highly recommend taking advantage of that. And that's all I have. I know we're a little bit early, so I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any. But otherwise, I really, really appreciate everybody's time and attention, especially right after lunch. So I appreciate everybody who managed to stay awake with a full stomach. Thank you. No questions? Awesome. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I like to have a conversation. So I'm part of the CSAR team at Recorded Future, and we have to do this all the time, where I like to have this conversation with, hey, this is a known bad tool, but I know that our developers also use it. So, I mean, generally what I do is we have, these are the developer machines, and these machines are authorized to have 7-zip installed. Everything else isn't. It's not a perfect solution, but that way I know if our EDR catches anything outside of the developer solution, then outside the developer network, then that we should investigate. And and what I count on is we implement a bunch of these protections so that if we miss 7-zip, we've hopefully caught something else. But that's a really good question, and it's definitely a problem. Yes. I'm sorry. Hold on. I want everybody to hear that because I think that was a really good point. Do you mind? Yeah. Thank you.
Since earlier this spring, Zoom actually extracts with 7-zip now.
Oh, I did not know that.
Which creates a massive problem for the monitoring of exfiltration.
Yeah.
So something for everyone to think about. How do you monitor for that now?
Block Zoom.
I've seen that, but in a COVID or post-COVID era.
No. I mean that's a really good point, and thank you. Again, that's something I didn't know, so it's good to have that additional information and monitor for that. So thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, again, thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.